It was a crisp Saturday evening when James Harris, a successful entrepreneur known for his quiet demeanor and sharp intellect, decided to treat himself after a week of hard work. James, a tall black man with an impeccably tailored navy blue suit and an understated silver watch, exuded an air of confidence as he approached the doors of Le Mont Étoilé, the most exclusive fine dining restaurant in the city. The restaurant was famous for its opulent decor, world-renowned chefs, and clientele of celebrities, socialites, and CEOs. The grand crystal chandelier in the entrance hall sparkled against the dim ambient lighting, casting a luxurious glow on the polished marble floors. James had made a reservation weeks in advance, knowing how coveted a table at the establishment was. As James walked toward the hostess stand, he couldn't help but notice the subtle glances from the other patrons. A few eyebrows raised. Others whispered behind champagne glasses. James wasn't unfamiliar with these reactions. Even as a self-made millionaire, he had faced prejudices his entire life. But tonight, he brushed off the murmurs, ready to enjoy an evening of fine dining and solitude. The hostess, a young woman with a sleek bun and a clipboard in hand, gave him a tight-lipped smile as he approached. "Good evening," James began warmly. "I have a reservation for Harris at 8 p.m. The hostess glanced at her list, hesitated for a brief moment, and then looked up with a rehearsed apologetic expression. "I'm sorry, sir, but we seem to be fully booked tonight. Perhaps there's been a mistake." James frowned slightly. "That's surprising. I received a confirmation email just this morning." Before the hostess could respond, a sharply dressed maitre d' approached. His eyes flicked to James, scanning him with a subtle condescension that James could feel in his bones. "I'm sorry, sir," the maitre d' interjected smoothly, "but we have a strict policy of accommodating only our regular clientele. Perhaps a different establishment would be more suitable for you." The comment hit like a slap in the face, but James maintained his composure. "I see," he said calmly. "So, my reservation is being denied because I'm not a regular?" The maitre d' smiled thinly. "I assure you, it's not personal. We simply cater to a very specific clientele, and you may not align with the ambiance we're cultivating." The implication was crystal clear. James stood silently for a moment, his jaw tightening. Then, with a polite nod, he turned and left, the sting of discrimination burning in his chest. What they didn't know was that James had never been the type to let injustice slide. As he stepped into the cool night air, his resolve hardened. By the time he reached his car, he had already started making calls. Tomorrow, the world of Le Mont Étoilé was about to change forever. The morning sun rose over the city as James sat in his sleek black office chair, sipping a steaming cup of coffee. His penthouse office offered a panoramic view of downtown, but his eyes weren't on the skyline. Instead, they were fixed on his laptop screen, scrolling through financial reports and corporate portfolios. The previous night's insult lingered in his mind, but James wasn't one to dwell on emotions. He was a man of action. A soft knock on the door broke his concentration. "Come in," James called out, his deep voice steady. The door opened, revealing Sarah, his executive assistant. She carried a tablet and wore a look of curiosity mixed with concern. "Good morning, Mr. Harris," she began. "I saw the emails you sent last night about Le Mont Étoilé. Are you really thinking of purchasing it?" James leaned back in his chair, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I don't think, Sarah. I act. That restaurant's culture needs a wake-up call, and I'm just the man to deliver it." Sarah nodded, impressed but not surprised. She had worked with James long enough to know he rarely backed down from a challenge. "I've already contacted the owner's representatives. It seems the restaurant has been struggling financially for a while now. The pandemic hit them hard, and their exclusivity policy hasn't helped. They're discreetly entertaining offers." James raised an eyebrow. "Perfect. Set up a meeting with their board as soon as possible. Today, if they can manage it." Sarah hesitated for a moment. "Are you sure this is worth it, sir? There are other ways to address what happened last night." James's expression grew serious, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "Sarah, this isn't just about what happened to me. It's about sending a message to them and anyone else who thinks they can treat people differently based on the color of their skin or how they look." Sarah nodded, her respect for James deepening. "Understood. I'll make the arrangements." By noon, James was seated at a long, polished table in a private conference room. Across from him sat the restaurant's owner, an older man with silver hair and a tailored suit. His lawyer and financial advisor flanked him, their faces carefully neutral. James wasted no time. I understand your establishment is seeking new ownership, he began, his tone direct yet calm. The owner shifted uncomfortably, sensing the authority in James's demeanor. That's correct, he replied. Do you have a proposal in mind? James slid a folder across the table. This is my offer. I believe you'll find it more than generous given your current financial standing. The owner opened the folder, his eyes widening as he scanned the figures. The lawyer and advisor exchanged quick glances. James had done his homework, offering a sum that not only covered the restaurant's debts, but also left the current owner with a substantial profit. After a few moments of tense silence, the owner cleared his throat. Mr. Harris, this is a very compelling offer. I'll need to review it with my team, but I don't see any reason why we couldn't move forward. James nodded, his expression unreadable. I'll expect your answer by the end of the day. As James left the conference room, he felt a sense of satisfaction. The wheels were in motion, and by tomorrow, Le Mont Étoilé would no longer belong to the man who had allowed prejudice to fester within its walls. The deal was finalized by nightfall. By the next morning, James Harris was the official owner of Le Mont Étoilé. It had all happened so quickly that the staff, still recovering from the previous night's bustling dinner service, had no idea their world had shifted overnight. James arrived at the restaurant promptly at 10 a.m., dressed in a sharp charcoal suit and carrying the calm confidence of a man on a mission. The restaurant was still closed to the public, but the staff were busy preparing for the day ahead. Servers polished glasses, chefs inspected produce deliveries, and the maitre d', the same man who had dismissed James so cruelly, stood near the hostess stand reviewing reservations. James entered through the front doors, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. Heads turned as he walked in, but this time, no one whispered. The silence was thick with confusion, and some staff exchanged nervous glances. They recognized him. But why was he back? The maitre d' approached, his practiced smile faltering as he drew closer. Sir, he began hesitantly. I believe I mentioned that our clientele policy. James held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. I'm not here as a customer, James said evenly. Gather the staff. All of them. Now the authority in his voice left no room for argument. The maitre d' blinked, then nodded stiffly. Of course. Within minutes, the entire team had assembled in the main dining area. Chefs in crisp white jackets, servers in their polished uniforms, and even the cleaning staff stood shoulder to shoulder, their expressions ranging from confusion to apprehension. James stood at the center of the room, his commanding presence impossible to ignore. Good morning, he began, his voice calm yet firm. My name is James Harris, and as of last night I am the new owner of Le Mont Étoilé. A wave of shocked murmurs swept through the room. The maitre d' paled, his previous arrogance replaced by visible discomfort. James let the moment hang in the air before continuing. Some of you might remember me from my visit 2 nights ago. I came here as a customer and was turned away. Not because I didn't have a reservation or couldn't pay, but because I didn't fit the image you think this establishment should uphold. Several employees lowered their eyes, guilt creeping across their faces. I bought this restaurant not because I need it, but because I believe in creating spaces where everyone, regardless of their background, feels welcome and respected. That starts today. James's gaze swept the room, landing on the maitre d'. If anyone has a problem with that vision, you're free to leave now. But I assure you, this is a new era for Le Mont Étoilé, and I expect every single person here to embody the values of dignity, respect, and inclusivity. The room was silent, the weight of his words pressing down on every person present. James didn't need to raise his voice. The authority in his tone was enough to make his message clear. Now, he said, his tone softening slightly, let's get to work. We have a restaurant to run. The staff of Le Mont Étoilé dispersed reluctantly after James's commanding speech, their usual morning rhythm disrupted by his presence. Whispers filled the kitchen and prep areas as employees exchanged wide-eyed glances and hurried conversations. Can you believe it? One server whispered to another as they folded napkins in the corner. He's the owner now. The same guy we turned away. Yeah, muttered the other, his face tight with unease. And the way he talked about making changes. You think we're in trouble? Meanwhile, in the maitre d's office, the man himself paced nervously. His hands fidgeted with a silver pen, his once certain demeanor now replaced with raw anxiety. Memories of his dismissal of James replayed in his mind like a bad movie. Every smirk, every condescending word, it all came rushing back. How could I have known? He muttered to himself. his voice low but laced with frustration. He didn't look the part. He stopped mid-sentence, realizing how shallow the excuse sounded even in his own head. Out on the floor, James walked through the restaurant, inspecting every detail with a discerning eye. The gilded mirrors, the chandeliers dripping with crystals, the pristine white tablecloths. It was an image of luxury, but to him, it felt hollow. What good was opulence if it came at the cost of human dignity? Sarah, who had joined him after handling final administrative details, approached with a clipboard. "How do you want to proceed, Mr. Harris?" she asked. James thought for a moment. "Schedule a team meeting after closing tonight. I want everyone there." "Understood." Sarah hesitated, then added, "You know it's going to take more than one speech to change the culture here." James nodded. "I know. But I've always believed that real change starts with accountability. If we don't address what's broken, we'll never fix it." As the day wore on, James observed the staff closely. Some seemed eager to impress, their actions deliberate as they worked through their tasks. Others moved with visible discomfort, their glances avoiding James whenever he walked by. When the first dinner reservations began to arrive, James noticed something telling. A family of 4 entered, their attire modest yet neat. They seemed hesitant, as if unsure whether they belonged in such a lavish setting. Before anyone else could approach, James stepped forward with a welcoming smile. "Good evening," he said warmly. "Welcome to Le Mont Étoilé. Do you have a reservation?" The family looked surprised but nodded. "Yes, we do," the father said, his voice tinged with relief. James gestured toward a table by the window. "Right this way." He watched as the family settled in, their initial tension melting away. It was a small moment, but to James it symbolized the kind of environment he wanted to create. A place where anyone could walk through the doors and feel they belonged. The night continued with a mix of unease and quiet progress. The staff worked diligently, though the usual chatter and camaraderie were noticeably absent. Change, as James knew, didn't come easily. By the time the last table was cleared and the restaurant locked for the night, James was ready. He stood in the center of the dining room, surrounded by the staff. His gaze swept over them, not with judgment, but with the weight of expectation. "Let's talk," he began. The dining room of Le Mont Étoilé was eerily quiet, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning. The staff gathered in a loose circle, their faces a mixture of unease, guilt, and guarded curiosity. James stood at the center, his posture steady, his presence commanding but not intimidating. "Let's start with honesty," James began, his voice calm but firm. "I didn't just buy this restaurant to prove a point. I bought it because I saw potential. A place that could represent excellence, not just in food and service, but in values." His eyes swept the room, meeting the gaze of each employee. Some shifted uncomfortably, while others held his gaze, their expressions unreadable. "But first," James continued, "we need to address what happened 2 nights ago. When I walked through those doors, I was judged, not for my character, not for my intentions, but for how I looked." He turned to the maitre d', whose face flushed a deep crimson. "I'd like to hear from you first. Tell me, why was I turned away?" The maitre d' hesitated, his hands gripping the edge of a chair. I thought," he stammered, then stopped, taking a deep breath. "I thought you weren't the type of customer we usually serve. You didn't look like you belonged here." James nodded, his expression unreadable. "And what does someone who belongs here look like? In your mind?" The maitre d's shoulders sagged. "I don't know," he admitted quietly. "I guess I've been so used to seeing a certain type of clientele, wealthy, polished, connected, that I made assumptions. It was wrong. I know that now." James let the words hang in the air before addressing the rest of the staff. "How many of you felt the same way?" A few hesitant hands went up, their owners looking away in shame. "This isn't about pointing fingers," James said, his tone softening slightly. "It's about understanding. Bias, whether it's conscious or not, doesn't just hurt individuals. It undermines everything we're supposed to stand for as a team and as a business." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I'm not here to fire anyone, but I am here to set a new standard. Moving forward, this restaurant will be a place where every person who walks through that door is treated with respect and dignity. No exceptions." The staff exchanged uncertain glances, the weight of his words settling over them like a heavy fog. James stepped closer to the circle. "I want to hear from you," he said. "What changes do you think we need to make? What can we do better?" For a moment there was only silence, Then a young server, barely out of her teens, raised her hand. "I think we need training," she said hesitantly. "About how to treat people. Not just the rich ones or the ones who look like they belong, but everyone." James smiled faintly. "Exactly. And that's where we'll start." He turned to Sarah, who stood at the edge of the room with a notepad in hand. "Schedule sensitivity training for the entire staff. Mandatory. And I'll be attending too." The maitre d' raised his hand cautiously. "What about the policies we've had in place? The ones about dress codes and reservations?" James considered this for a moment. "Policies should enhance the experience, not exclude people. We'll review them together. If they need to change, they will." As the meeting continued, the tension began to ease. Staff members who had been silent earlier started to speak up, sharing their thoughts and concerns. It wasn't an easy conversation, but it was a necessary one. By the time the meeting ended, the atmosphere in the room had shifted. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. James looked around at his team, flawed, human, but willing to try. "We're not just serving food here," he said, his voice steady. "We're building something bigger. Let's make it count." The morning after the staff meeting, Le Monde Étoilé hummed with a cautious energy. Staff moved purposefully through the dining room, their usual chatter replaced with subdued focus. Though the air was still thick with the remnants of past tensions, there was an undeniable undercurrent of change. James arrived early, as he often did, stepping into the restaurant with a quiet confidence. He had spent much of the night reflecting on the meeting, the confessions, and the steps ahead. Change wouldn't happen overnight, but he was determined to make it stick. Sarah approached him as he reviewed the day's schedule. "The sensitivity training has been arranged," she said. "It starts next week." "Good," James replied with a nod. "And the updated policy drafts?" "On your desk," she said. "I've included suggestions for making the reservation process more inclusive. Dress code guidelines are also revised to focus on appropriateness rather than exclusivity." "Perfect," James said, a small smile breaking through. "Thank you, Sarah. Let's make sure the team is briefed before the changes go live." As the doors opened for the day, James took his usual place near the entrance. Today, he was more involved in greeting guests, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by the staff. Mid-morning, a familiar face appeared in the doorway. The family James had welcomed the night before. The father looked surprised to see him, but offered a warm smile. "Good to see you again," James said, extending a hand. "Welcome back." The man shook his hand firmly. "Thank you," he replied, glancing around the luxurious space. "It feels different today." "Better," James chuckled. "That's the goal." He personally led the family to their table, his presence a quiet assurance that things were changing. Around the room, staff members observed the interaction, some nodding subtly to themselves as if understanding the unspoken message. Later that afternoon, as James reviewed invoices in his office, the maitre d' knocked softly on the door. "Come in," James said, looking up. The maitre d' stepped inside, his usual composure replaced by a nervous humility. "Mr. Harris," he began, "I wanted to apologize for how I treated you that night. I judged you unfairly, and it was wrong. I see that now." James regarded him for a moment, then gestured to a chair. "Have a seat." The maitre d' hesitated before sitting down. "I've been in this business for years," he continued, his voice heavy with regret, "and somewhere along the way, I lost sight of what really matters. I was too focused on appearances, on the image of this place instead of the people in it." James leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Acknowledging that is the first step," he said. "But change isn't just about recognizing the problem. It's about what you do next." The maitre d' nodded earnestly. "I'm ready to do better, whatever it takes." James extended his hand across the desk. "Then let's work on it together." As the day wound down, James stood by the window in his office, watching the last of the lunch crowd filter out. The restaurant wasn't just a business to him anymore. It was a symbol of resilience and transformation. When Sarah walked in with the evening reports, James turned to her with a quiet smile. "This is only the beginning," he said. "But I think we're heading in the right direction." And for the first time since taking ownership of Le Monde Étoilé, James felt a flicker of hope, not just for the restaurant, but for the community it served. 2 weeks later, Le Monde Étoilé was abuzz with anticipation. The restaurant's grand reopening was more than just a marketing event. It was a statement. Flyers had been distributed across the city, emphasizing the new policies of inclusion and respect. A tagline beneath the restaurant's name read, A table for everyone. James stood at the entrance, adjusting his cufflinks as the first guests began to arrive. The staff, now unified and better trained, stood ready to greet them with smiles that felt genuine rather than forced. The maitre d', a changed man, led the team with a renewed sense of purpose, ensuring every guest felt welcomed from the moment they stepped inside. Inside, the restaurant gleamed under the soft glow of its chandeliers. The decor had been subtly updated, with artwork celebrating diverse cultures adorning the walls. Tables were set with pristine white linens, their arrangements elegant but inviting. The atmosphere was warm, not intimidating, a deliberate shift from the exclusivity that once defined the space. As the dining room filled, James moved between tables, engaging with guests. He stopped at one where the young family he had served before was seated. "Good evening," he said warmly. "I'm glad you could make it tonight." The father grinned. "Wouldn't miss it," he said. "This place feels completely different now. You've done something amazing here." James nodded, his heart swelling with quiet pride. "Thank you. I hope you enjoy the evening." Halfway through the night, James stepped to the center of the room, a microphone in hand. The hum of conversation died down as all eyes turned to him. "Good evening, everyone," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Thank you for joining us tonight. This reopening isn't just about fresh paint or new policies. It's about a new beginning, a chance to create a place where everyone feels valued and respected, no matter who they are." He glanced around the room, his gaze settling briefly on the staff lined up near the kitchen doors. "To my team, thank you for embracing this vision with me. Change isn't easy, but together, we've made it possible." A ripple of applause filled the room, staff and guests alike clapping in unison. "And to all of you," James continued, addressing the diners, "thank you for giving us the opportunity to serve you. This restaurant is more than just a business, it's a community, and I promise you, every single person who walks through these doors will be treated with the dignity they deserve." As the applause swelled, James caught Sarah's eye. She gave him a small nod, her expression one of quiet pride. The rest of the evening unfolded smoothly, with laughter and conversation filling the air. By the time the last guest departed, the staff gathered in the dining room, exhausted but exhilarated. James stood at the head of the group, his expression serious but kind. "Tonight was a success," he said, "but this is just the beginning. The real challenge is maintaining this standard every single day. I know we can do it, together." The staff nodded, their faces reflecting a mix of determination and newfound camaraderie. As James locked the doors that night, he took a moment to look back at the empty dining room. It wasn't just a restaurant anymore. It was a dream realized, a testament to the power of perseverance and the belief that true change is always possible.